virtually, of course. Today, we have another great event for you. The library is thrilled to have the opportunity to host a live conversation with two best-selling authors, Kristin Harmel and Natasha Lester. Thank you very much, Kristin, for joining us from your home in Florida, and to Simon & Schuster for making this event possible. Thank you very much also to Natasha for joining us from Australia, and to Hachette Book Group for making this event possible. I'm lucky to have my colleague and librarian Jennifer Eisman here tonight with me as well to host this conversation. And lastly, thank you also to Andreas at Paragraphe Bookstore for collaborating with us on this wonderful event. If you'd like to purchase Kristin and or Natasha's latest novels, we'll remind you of the details of how to do so at the end. Or you can always contact the librarian, or you can always put your name on the wait list for the books at the library. To begin, I will share condensed bios. Kristin Harmel is the New York Times best-selling author of the Book of Lost Names, The Winemaker's Wife, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, and a dozen other novels that have been translated into 28 languages and sold all over the world. Kristin was born just outside Boston. After graduating with a degree in journalism from the University of Florida, she spent time living in Paris and Los Angeles and now lives in Orlando. She's also the co-founder and co-host of the weekly web show and podcast, Friends and Fiction. Natasha Lester worked as a marketing executive for L'Oreal before penning the New York Times and internationally best-selling novel, The Paris Orphan. She's also the author of the USA Today bestseller, The Paris Seamstress. When she's not writing, she loves collecting vintage fashion, traveling, reading, practicing yoga, and playing with her 3 children. Natasha lives in Perth, Western Australia. Thank you also, Natasha, for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, and now I'll pass it over to Jen.
Before we begin our interview, I would like to give you a brief summary of the 2 books that we'll be discussing this evening. Kristin's latest novel, The Forest of Vanishing Stars, raised in the unforgiving wilderness of Eastern Europe after being kidnapped, a young woman in 1941 vows to teach a group of Jews fleeing the Nazi horror how to survive in the forest until she's betrayed and her past and present collide. In Natasha's latest novel, The Riviera House, Remy Lang mysteriously inherits a home on the Riviera. While working on her vintage fashion business, she finds a catalog of the artwork stolen during World War II and makes a shocking discovery that leads her on an extraordinary journey to the past.
So we'd like to open up this evening conversation with a question for Kristin. Hi, Kristin, welcome back. Thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So could you please share with the audience how the idea behind this exquisite novel first came to you? And I'm referring, of course, to The Forest of Vanishing Stars.
Well, thank you for the compliment embedded in the question. I appreciate that. It's actually kind of crazy because, much like Natasha, I tend to write about France. So the fact that this novel was set in Eastern Poland was a little bit of a departure for me. And part of that was that I felt like I had written several novels about France. And in fact, I should also say my next novel is about France. So it's not like I departed for long. But I wanted to challenge myself to do something a little bit different, something that was a little bit outside my comfort zone. Of course, if I had realized that I was doing that right as a pandemic was kicking off, I might have chosen not to, branch out at that time. But, you live and learn. I had heard about the story of the Bielski partisans, who were real life Jewish refugees who hid in the forests of Eastern Poland and survived the war that way. I had heard about that about a decade earlier. And I think that story had always stuck with me because of the fact that it was such a wonderful story of survival and of people taking their fate into their own hands in a really brave way and fighting back. And I just was very inspired by it. But that stuck with me at a time that I was not yet writing about World War II. And I think when I was searching for something else to write about that was a little bit different, that story came back to me. But beyond that, I can't explain really why I felt so drawn to this. But it was midway through writing it that I discovered that my dad's side of the family, which is my Jewish side of the family, actually came from an area of Poland not that far away from where the novel was set, which is really interesting because so much of the novel is about identity and how much of our story we carry with us in our blood, how much of it, we can shape ourselves, all of those things. And if you had asked me before I wrote this novel and before I discovered that, how much of our fate is kind of pre-written, it is already within us. I think I would have said not that much, but then to realize I was drawn to this story that perhaps did have a connection to my not that distant ancestors was really interesting. So it kind of made me question things about my own identity too. That was a really long answer. Sorry. I cede the floor to the much more interesting Natasha.
Thank you so much, Kristin, for your answer. And you did beat me to a few of my questions for you that were supposed to come later on, but that's okay. Now I will pass it on to Jennifer, who will ask Natasha a question.
Welcome, Natasha. First of all, let me say I love the book. It was beautifully written. You wove an amazing tale. I have a background in art history and Italian studies, so it was really fascinating. I get really intrigued with the author notes, the references. I even picked up, the other book you mentioned a lot, Search, and I'll practice my French with the other one as well. I picked up that one as well. So my first question for you is, what inspired you to write the story?
It was really Rose Valland who was the inspiration behind the book. So I first came across Rose in Anne Seber's book, Les Parisiennes, How the Women of Paris Lived, Loved and Died in the 1940s. And I was, there are so many stories about resistance, putting their life on the line to save other people, whether they be downed Allied pilots in France that they're trying to get out on escape lines, or Jewish families, for instance. But I'd never heard a story about anyone risking their life for art. And I was really intrigued by what kind of person would do that for, what are essentially inanimate objects, oils on canvas, chunks of marble, etc. I mean, of course, art is so much more than that, as the book kind of explores. But I loved this idea of Rose's, the character she played during the war. And that was really what drew me in. And subsequently, not long after I read about Rose Valland, who was a real-life art spy who spied on the Nazis for years whilst working in an art museum where the Nazis were transiting all of the paintings they were stealing from the Jewish families. Not long after that, I read about Goering's catalogue, which was his kind of summary of all the artworks that he stole for his manor home of Carinol. And there was a connection with Rose and that catalogue that really intrigued me. And so it was those two things kind of coalescing and coming together that kickstarted the book. And around the same time, I read another novel, a nonfiction book by Mary Lovell called The Riviera House, about an American actress's amazing house on the French Riviera where she had these great parties during the 1920s and 1930s. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like fun. I might write a book about a fabulous home on the French Riviera as well. So it was those three things coming together. And it was a lot of fun to write, as well as to explore more about Rose.
That's awesome.
Thank you for that. I'll pass it to Danielle.
Okay, thank you, Natasha. So for those who couldn't quite see Natasha's book, this is her book in the background. So I will ask Kristin another question. So I will skip over my identity question for now.
Sorry.
No problem. So I did read that in terms of research for this book, you did read extensively, as well as you spoke to both Aaron Bielski and Vadim Sidorovich. Sorry if I'm butchering his name, PhD, a wildlife expert who specializes in the Nalaboki forest. So can you tell us a little bit about these interviews and how they shaped your novel?
That is such a great question. I was so fortunate to get to speak to both of those men. I like to say that Aaron Bielski gave sort of this collection of details I had about these Jewish refugees. He gave the details a beating heart. And I think that Vadim did that for the forest. I mean, he brought the forest alive for me. When I started writing this book, or when I proposed this book, my plan entirely was to go and spend time in the forest and experience it for myself. But I began writing this book in February. I guess I pitched it in February of 2020 and began writing it in March of 2020. And of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. The entire world shut down. And so there was no traveling to Belarus, which is where the forest is located now. So to be able to work with this expert, Vadim Sidorovich, was such a godsend. It was such a gift. He had actually written a nonfiction book about the forest, about the flora, fauna, and human history of this particular forest. And so a lot of my initial research had to do with his book. A lot of the initial details I came up with were from his book. But then there were a lot of little things I couldn't figure out, or little details that were so specific that they wouldn't be in a textbook. And so I took a chance of reaching out to him, and I thought, what are the odds that he's going to speak English? What are the odds that he's going to even respond to this email? But his life had kind of been put on hold because of the pandemic. He leads wilderness tours into the forest and was not doing that at the present time. And so we worked out an arrangement where I paid him by the hour, and he answered everything I sent him, which was amazing. If he didn't know the answer, he would find someone who did. And if I didn't understand the answer, or if he felt like merely describing it wasn't going to be enough, he'd go out into the forest and take pictures of the things he was talking about. So, I mean, he truly completely brought it alive. And Aaron Bielski was is a fascinating man. He's 94 now. He was 14 when the Germans came and took his parents away. And his parents were murdered just a few days later, along with a lot of other Jewish citizens in that particular area. He fled into the forest with his brothers. They ultimately set up a camp that swelled in size by the end of the war to 1,200 people. So there were 1,200 Jewish refugees as part of this group that moved around together and lived through the war. And his particular job within that group was to sneak into the Jewish ghettos and to tell people they had to get out or they weren't going to live. So it wasn't just a group that saved people who came to them, they actively recruited people to save. So to talk to him and to get his perspective on not just the ins and outs of daily life in the forest, which I felt like I had a fairly good grasp of that just from, reading extensively about it. But to be able to ask him things like, how did you find the courage to do that? What were your thoughts about your parents when you were in the forest? What did you learn from that experience? How did it shape the rest of your life? How did it make you who you are today? Like, those were just incredible questions to get to ask somebody who survived something like that. And I was blown away by it. I'm actually supposed to meet up with him and his wife either next week or the week after, which I'm really excited about. They just live, they live just a few hours from me here in Florida, which is amazing. So those were, I could not have written the book without those two men.
Thank you for sharing that, Kristin. I'll pass it over to Jen.
Natasha, you've done a tremendous amount of research on this book. That's clear. Can you talk to us a bit about the process and what went into it?
Of course. So firstly, if you're writing a book about Rose Valland as a character, the best place to start is her memoir, which she did write. It hasn't been published in English. It's only available in French. Luckily, I do speak French, although reading a thick book is quite challenging for me. So it was really one chapter a day to kind of get through that. And so, as a writer, when you come across a memoir, you get very excited because it's a way of bringing the character to life. But with Rose, her memoir is very much focused on the day-to-day life of the Jeu de Paume, where she was spying on the Nazis. And she never takes you outside of the museum in her memoir. So it was very difficult to imagine her being a main character in the book because, of course, the book couldn't just take place in the Jeu de Paume Museum. You have to go with your characters outside of their working environment and meet their friends and family, the people they love, etc. And I didn't feel that I could do that with Rose, given the scant details about her life. I felt that I would be making up so much about her that really she would become a fictional character. And I didn't feel that I could then call her Rose Valland. So that was why I introduced Eliane into the story to work alongside Rose in the museum, because then Rose could be still a part of the narrative, but not the main character driving the story. So it meant for me trying to access Rose's character her in other ways. As well as reading her memoir, I went to the Musée National Archives in Paris and all of her notebooks that she kept during the war. So she was basically in the museum every day, pretending not to speak German and recording in these secret notebooks that she took with her the details of the names of the paintings that came through the Jeu de Paume Museum, a description of the artwork, the family that it was stolen from, and the secret destination it was being sent to for storage by Hitler or Goering or the other Nazi officials. And it was, this a tremendously risky job. If the Germans had told her that if she ever spoke about what she was doing, they would kill her. Obviously, if they found out she was speaking German, they would kill her as well. In fact, Colonel von Boer, who ran the museum, he told her at one point he would take her to the German border and liquidate her. So she knew that her life was on the line every day. But so I wanted to really access how that might have felt, because there's only 2 places in her memoir where she talks specifically about her feelings. On one occasion, she mentions the dread she felt in her stomach as she approached the museum each day to show her pass, which allowed her entry into the museum. And on another occasion, she talks about how the artworks that were being stolen from the Jewish families would arrive at the museum to the clattering sound of the Germans' boots in this place that was run with concentration camp-like discipline. And it was that wording that really gave me a sense of what it felt like to be her pretending to be somebody else for 4 years. But as well as that, when I visited the museum, there were 2 things I wanted to do there. One of them was one of the galleries in the Jeu de Paume Rose called the Salle des Martyrs, the Room of the Martyrs. And that was where the Nazis kept all the art that they considered to be degenerate, which was all your Impressionists and Modernist pieces, so Picasso's, Van Gogh's, Matisse's, Monet's, Manet's, etc. And she called it that because these artworks are basically left there to languish over the course of the war. And so I'd managed to come by a plan of how the galleries were set out during the Second World War. And so I knew where the Salle des Martyrs was located, because the interior is all very different. The exterior is still the same. And so I found that spot when I was in the museum. And, it's possibly the overactive imagination of a fiction writer, because we do tend to have overactive imaginations. But that place in the museum, to me, it feels really haunted. You can feel that something very sad happened there. And so that was just one way of getting into Rose's character. And the second way also happened at that museum, where it has these beautiful arched windows along one side of it. And the evening I was there was this magnificent sunset, golden orange sky, and through the arched windows you can see the Eiffel Tower, which is obviously this symbol of France. And so for me, it was standing in this arched window, this beautiful sky, looking at the Eiffel Tower backdrop by gold and orange, and imagining what it would have been like to be Rose, seeing the same thing, but with an armed Nazi behind you, knowing that, one wrong move and you would be dead. And so you sort of, as well as the archives and the memoirs, it's walking in your character's footsteps if you can, COVID dependent. Obviously, this was just pre-COVID. I snuck this trip in to kind of find your characters in ways different to what is actually left on the historical record. So that was, a really wonderful part of the research for me in writing the book.
Thank you. And it really does come through. It shows that extra layer, that emotion that really shows in the book. You expertly wove it through the story. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So next I have a question for Kristin. It's related more to the style of writing. Why choose an element of magic surrealism to begin the telling of this story and then transition into a different approach?
Well, excellent question. I don't think it does have sort of a dark fairy tale sense to it at the beginning, but I don't think it really is magical realism. I think the first couple of chapters unfold from the viewpoint of Jerusha, who is the woman who kidnaps a little girl named Inga, who becomes Yona, and raises her deep in the woods with virtually no human contact. So Jerusha is this woman who believes, so she's spent virtually her entire life living deep in the forest. She believes that nature speaks to her. She believes God is whispering to her through the trees and through the water. And she believes that she's been called to take this child. She has such a sense that this is her destiny and that this is what she has to do, that she becomes very single-minded about it, and makes some really strange decisions that result in Yona being completely isolated and completely cut off from society, but also very well educated, because that's something that Urusha always placed a lot of stock in. So to return to your question, I think it was just the point of view. It was the point of view of this woman who saw the world in a very different way than we did. And, I don't know that I can 100% answer whether Urusha did have a touch of magic, a touch of knowing, a touch of seeing the future, or if the decisions she made shaped things that were to come. So, for example, Yona's father is a character who we meet at the very beginning and who we see at a point later in the novel. And when we see him later in the novel, he has sort of, in a way, fulfilled what Urusha believed he would become. But did Urusha know that was coming, and that's why she had to take this child? Or did Urusha's taking the child turn him into this person he became? So it's kind of, I think of that along the same lines of, if you go to a fortune teller and the fortune teller tells you something about your future, they tell you you're going to meet a tall, dark, and handsome man with green eyes, and he's going to change your life. Well, you're going to notice the next tall, dark, and handsome man with green eyes who comes your way, and you might have a slightly different reaction to him that changes the course of your fate. And maybe, do you know what I mean? So it's like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? So, but to answer the question, I suppose, a little bit more directly, that is just the way Urusha entirely came to me as a character. That relationship, the relationship she had with Yona, the kind of person she was. And I loved writing it that way. Those were the most fun 2 chapters for me.
So I was going to ask you a question about Jerusha, because along the same lines, when I did admit to you I had trouble with the mother character in the Book of Lost Names, yes. Jerusha did sort of get under my skin a few times in this novel. How fun was it writing Jerusha's character?
Urusha was a really entertaining character to write. Not entertaining, but just complicated and psychologically complex and weird, just weird, And so it was really interesting to get into the skin of a character like that, who functions a little bit outside of societal norms and whose actions put into motion events that kind of can't be turned back. But from now on, I'll be sure to insert a character that just rubs you slightly the wrong way in every book. For Danielle, I'll make sure. I know, I do. I have a thing about writing weird women in maternal roles. I don't know what that is. I don't know what that's about.
Thank you, Kristin. I'll pass it back over to Jen.
That's funny. Natasha, as you're reading the story, the reader can't help but see the 2 themes of saving art and saving people. Do you think one is tied to the other, or do you think that this is an impossible choice? Like, how do you even choose between the 2?
You're right, it is an impossible choice. And, Eliane and her brother Luke have this debate partway through the novel where Eliane, when she realizes what is happening with the Jewish families of Paris and that they're being bussed out to Jauncey and other places, she says, are we putting our efforts into the wrong things? Should we be helping to save the people rather than artworks? What does art actually mean to people at this moment? And I want to put a debate in there because it's actually come up for me a couple of times in the course of my books, even back as early as The Paris Seamstress, when one of my characters is watching them pack the stained glass windows of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. She's wondering why it is that those are being saved rather than the children, etc. So it's something that's really come up for me a lot, and I wanted to really probe that with Eliane and Luc in this novel. and Luke's response is basically that, you know, he believes that everybody is doing their bit to save the part that they can save. And I think that's kind of where I came to in all of the reading and all of the research that I did, was that, you know, the people, and it's an interesting idea of, you know, how do you become a resistant? You know, what kind of person is motivated to put themselves last and to put everybody else first, in a way? Because by 1942, for example, the Germans issued this terrible edict that says that anyone involved in resistance activities, it's not just them who is going to be imprisoned and killed, it's their entire families. Even if their families are not involved in resistance in any way, it was meant to try to deter these acts of resistance. So it meant that, you know, somebody would have to be able to say, what I'm doing, this cause for art or for people, is larger than everybody that I love. And that's such a tremendous decision, I think. And when you're reading these accounts of all of the people who did resist, so with the artworks in Paris, it was not just Rose at the Jeu de Paume, all of the Louvre curators who were scattered through the French countryside looking after the national treasures that were stored in various chateaux, they were all part of the Maquis and part of the resistance. So they were all, as well as looking after the art, they were also, you know, working, getting Allied pilots through on escape lines, etc. And you just think, you know, those are just such incredible, amazing people. And it's hard to imagine many people in modern times in the Western world making that kind of sacrifice and saying, no, actually, my life and the lives of everybody I love, my children, my parents, my sisters, my brothers, are less than the greater cause of trying to save my culture and my country and all of the many people whose lives are in greater danger than my own, even though every action they took put their own lives in danger. And I just really wanted to look into that, because wasn't just, you know, for Parisian women in particular, who were largely or French women, largely the people left behind in France, because the men were either prisoner of war or had been sent to Germany on the service du travail obligatoire. You know, it was the day-to-day acts of resistance that they had to weigh up, or collaboration, in fact. You know, simply walking down the street and having a German soldier say good morning to them. You know, for many of them, you read their accounts and they're thinking, you know, if I don't say hello, which is what I want to do, that's an act of resistance. But then, is that just a foolhardy thing to do? Because by not saying hello, I'm risking the lives of my family. But to say hello, is that an act of collaboration? And how will that be viewed later on? And in fact, we know what happened to so many Parisian women in those months after the liberation of Paris. So there are so many, you know, larger acts of resistance and smaller acts of resistance too, that I wanted to unpick in the book, which is again why I created the character of Eliane to work alongside Rose, so I could use her as the vehicle. She has a large family. She has sisters and brothers and parents, so she has to weigh up those decisions. And she is the one who is moving around the streets of Paris, having to assess what her actions say about her position on resistance versus collaboration, and how much she can say no to the things she doesn't want to do, and what risks that will then cause for her family. So it's a really interesting question. And I think that every single person addressed it in their own way at those times. And, you know, if we didn't, you know, when you walk through the Louvre now, you know, Vermeer's Astronomer is one of the paintings that was stolen from Edouard de Rothschild. It transited through the Jeu de Paume. Rose recorded its details. It ended up at Neuschwanstein Castle, where she tracked the painting at the end of the war, to return it to Rothschild. He then donated it to the Louvre. And, you know, now people go to there are only 35 Vermeers in the world in existence now. So they go to the Louvre to see, you know, one of those Vermeers. And so few people know it has a swastika stamped on the back of it because of its journey through the Jeu de Paume. And it's a beautiful painting that we wouldn't be able to see unless Rose had done her work. So you think, well, actually, it's a beautiful gift to future generations, her work as well.
Yeah, so true. So very, very true. Hard decisions, but as you say, we're benefiting from it now. Yeah. Thank you for that. I'll turn it back to Danielle.
So, Kristen, you did touch upon the notion of identity a little bit earlier, and you did reveal that you had found out while writing this book that your dad's side of the family were Polish Jews from an area not far away from where the book is set. Can you tell us a little bit about how you felt when you discovered this and how it came about?
Well, that I had known, for a long time that side of the family was Jewish. My dad's side of the family was Jewish, but I didn't really grow up with that. My parents divorced when I was 11, and so that's about the age that I would have started asking questions about who are we, where do we come from, what's our heritage, what do you believe, all of those things. And my dad just wasn't around as much in those years. We weren't very close. We're much closer now, but on top of that, my dad's parents were both agnostic. So he wasn't raised with religion. So basically, that tradition that had been carried forward in his family sort of died with him because he wasn't raised with that. So there was no reason to carry that forward. Like there was nothing to carry forward. Although he has told me recently that when he was a little boy, his father did send him to Hebrew school, not because he wanted him to absorb the messages about religion, but because he wanted him to appreciate where he'd come from and what his ancestors had been through and what, the culture that he was a part of, which I thought was really interesting. That was something I had never known about my father. And, I'm glad that in some of this digging I've done for my novels, it's made me ask these questions and open these discussions with him. But as for how I found out, it was just my brother was doing our family research and sent me our family tree. It wasn't intended to be any kind of big revelation. I had looked at the family tree in the past, just from ancestry.com, and had never really looked at that because I had looked in the past about my mom's side of the family. I was looking into the villages in Ireland that her family had come from, which was my interest at the time. But when he sent it to me again, I was like, oh yeah, you know what? I do wonder where dad's side of the family came from. Let me look into that. And it turned out that my grandparents' had come from Poland right around the turn of the last century, but that my great-great-grandmother had actually traveled back to Europe as recently as 1933, and had spent months over there. I assumed to visit family members. She was 69 years old at the time, and I can't imagine she just, hopped on a boat alone and went on a pleasure cruise to Europe. Like it wasn't that. I'm sure she was going back to see family members. And that sounds like a silly thing to say or a silly thing to feel moved by, but it was just this idea that she was most likely in Poland 6 years before World War II began. You can tell from the census forms in the US that she still spoke Yiddish as her primary language. So I have to believe that she was still very connected to that part of her culture and that part of her past and that idea of where she'd come from. And so to think that she stepped back on a boat in 1933 and returned to the United States. And then just 6 short years later, these people that presumably she had gone to see were right in the middle of what was happening. And of course, what was happening was that in, all across Europe, Jewish people were being murdered, but particularly in Poland. I think more there than anywhere else. The Jewish population was really, really wiped out. And so that was just, I don't know, that just moved me in a way that I didn't expect it to, because I felt like I had always kind of intellectually known that, that my family was Jewish and Eastern European, but putting these names and faces and stories to it just meant something different. And, I started writing about World War II more than a decade ago, when that wasn't something I had ever looked into or ever thought about. And I think it's interesting where the roads lead us. I think it's interesting, when we're called to write about things that we can't even explain, like we can't explain why our interests lie in those areas or why we feel so compelled to do what we're doing. And this book in particular has made me really think a lot about those pieces of my past that I didn't know about and the role they've played in making me the human being and the writer I am today.
I think it's very interesting that in a book that has so many pages surrounded about the themes of identity, that it somehow also helped you discover pieces of your identity. So that was a nice compliment.
Well,
So
thank you.
thank you. I'll pass it back over to Jen.
Thanks, Danielle. Natasha, of all the characters you brought to life on paper, was there one that spoke to you more than the others, or one that was easier to create?
I think probably Remy, who's the main character in the contemporary storyline, was one of the easier ones. There's always something in every book that's particularly difficult, and in this one it was the quantity of the research, because the papers to do with the Nazi art thefts during the Second World War are spread over 35 different archives in 12 different countries. So it's a huge amount of paperwork. And of course, one person can't go to 35 archives in 12 countries. So I did have to be selective about which archives I felt were most relevant to my search. But even still, just doing the 2 archives in Paris and the archives in Washington, it was still an immense amount of paper to get through, as well as everything else. So that was quite challenging for this book. And then I always say that in every book, as well as that, there's something that the writing muse gifts you, and it's something different in every book. And for this book, it was Remy's character. So she literally just walked onto the page pretty much fully formed, and I was like, oh, thank goodness there's something that's going to be easy in this book. So I just said, okay, I'm just going to sit back and let you lead, and I'm just going to follow with my fingers typing furiously behind you. So Remy, and I guess, her story has got some quite wonderful elements to it, which I think are particularly good for this, time of COVID, where we're not traveling as much and we want a bit of escapism. War stories can be obviously quite heavy, so it's nice to have a little bit of lightness in there too. And I guess hopefully Remy does provide a little bit of that. So she has inherited mysteriously this fabulous home on the French Riviera. I always joke that I give my characters things that I wish would happen to me. So, in my last book, The Paris Secret, a character inherited a wardrobe of 65 vintage Dior gowns, which I absolutely wish would happen to me. So in this one, it was this fabulous Riviera mansion. I'm still waiting for my fairy godmother to bless me, but anyway. So she's gone to this beautiful home on the Riviera to escape a personal tragedy and to shoot the photographs for her next lookbook. She sells vintage fashion, again, personal interest of mine being woven in there as well. So that storyline has a lot of the things I love. She's collecting and selling vintage fashion for a start, so I get to write about beautiful historical garments, which I love to do. She's working with a photographer to recreate some beautiful vintage fashion photography by photographers like Louise Dahl-Wolfe, who did a lot of amazing work for Harper's Bazaar during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. She was one of the first photographers to shoot outdoors. And if readers are interested, go and Google some of her photographs online. They're absolutely exquisite. And so I got to explore that other particular passion of mine in Remy's story. She meets a hot guy on the Riviera, so that was pretty fun as well. So all in all, her story was just a beautiful, lovely gift that was thankfully very easy to write, because I tend to write my historical narratives first and then the contemporary, and then weave them in at a later date. So after, loving the historical, but it being immensely hard work, to then fall into this lovely contemporary storyline was actually really fun. And I really love doing that with Remy.
The fashion you described was absolutely beautiful. I almost gasped, without giving too much away of the story, when Molly touches the gown, and I was like, oh no. My heart
yes,
stopped,
children and vintage fashion are not good pairs.
No. I'll turn it over to Danielle.
So my question now is for Natasha. I was going to congratulate you on paying homage to Louise Dahl-Wolfe, but you just mentioned her. So I will ask another question, no problem. The settings in both timelines of your book are so rich in detail. How did you go about making sure, for example, that both the Paris of the late 30s and early 40s, as well as modern day Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat, where the Riviera house is located, and the seemingly magical seaside village of Ez, had such an authentic feel?
So I was very lucky that for this book, I did the research in December 2018 and January 2019. So back when travel was still something we could do. And because I don't think I could have written this book without having walked in the footsteps of my characters. So I mentioned before that I was able to go to the Jeu de Paume Museum, which again, I don't think I could have done without that. Also, I went back to the Louvre, which I'd been to many, many times before, but the book opens with the evacuation of the Louvre, which happened in August 1939 when the museum was actually emptied of everything. And it's interesting how there's a particular scene that takes place around the moving of the winged Victory of Samothrace, which sits at the top of the Daru staircase, and is 5.5 meters tall. It weighs tons. It's an incredible feat to move this statue out of the Louvre, and the symbolism inherent in a statue being called Victory, having this very risky removal, was something I wanted to write about. So you just see the pieces in a very different way when you've read those stories about them and seen photographs in the archives of how they were managed throughout the war. Even the Mona Lisa, her journey through France during the war was quite incredible. And, the way, so her crate that she was moved in was coded in a particular way, so they would always be able to identify La Joconde. And the codes inherent in the way she was managed were just, for a writer, a code is always fascinating. So I've used those and woven those into the story too. So you even see things like the Mona Lisa in a very different way. And I think, going and doing all those things specifically when for the book you're writing enables you to write about those things in a way that I wouldn't have been able to do if I'd just been drawing on my memories of the last time I was at the Louvre and had, kind of shuffled past the Mona Lisa with everybody else. And then I went down to the Riviera for a couple of weeks, actually, because I didn't know which particular Riviera town I wanted to use as the base for my Riviera house. And I went to Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat initially because I wanted to go and see the Villa Efresi de Rothschild, which is this beautiful mansion in that town. And I thought maybe it would provide some inspiration for my Riviera house. And the minute I drove up to the house and saw it, I thought, okay, it's not just going to be inspiration. This is my house because it's pink for a start. I mean, a pink house, it's just going to be magical from the outset. And it's just a glorious, particularly the gardens, I think, are what really attracted me. So all of the features that readers will read about in the book, the fountains that dance in time to music, the water cascades that lead up to the Love Temple, which is a replica of the Petit Trianon at Versailles, the different gardens, the Lapidary Garden, the Rose Garden, the exotics, the Japanese Garden, etc. They're all basically ripped from real life and supplanted into my book because I didn't feel I could improve on what was actually there. So I snapped a million photographs, and I always use those when I go back to the writing and refer to all of those photographs. I went to Aix. I went to lots of different towns. And as soon as I drove into Aix, I absolutely fell in love. And my kids were all with me. And we basically did what Remy and Adam do when they go to Aix, which is, it's a perched medieval village. So it was perched on top of a cliff. So they were able to look out and for defense, etc., which gives it this amazing outlook. And there's lots of little narrow alleys winding through the town. And so we would just take one and then we get to the end and we'd decide whether to go right, left, or straight ahead, and we'd take turns. And so we just explored the town that way very impulsively and spontaneously. And so I let Remy and Adam do that in my book too, because it was just a really wonderful way to get into the feel of that village. And when I was staying at the Riviera, I was actually very lucky. The hotel we stayed in is actually a villa that was once owned by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. So it was very hard not to be inspired when I was staying in the former home of one of America's greatest writers. So all in all, it was a dream trip. And one I look back on now and think, wow, it's so hard to imagine doing that again in this environment. So I was very lucky. And it really helped me to bring all of those locations to life in the book.
It sounds like it was definitely meant to be. And you mentioned the lookbooks. Readers will stumble across Remy's lookbooks. Is there perhaps a part of you that is Remy?
Definitely my love of vintage fashion is definitely, I've gifted that to Remy. I usually, I say that for my contemporary characters in the book, I always give them a job that I would love to have if I wasn't a writer. So in my previous book, The Paris Secret, the main character was a curator at a museum, a fashion curator at a museum, and a conservator. And then in this one, she's a vintage fashion collector, because I do collect a little bit of vintage fashion, but I don't have the time to invest in that fully. But in my books, I can explore that, which is really wonderful. So I've also created on Instagram an account called Remy's Vintage Closet. So if readers want to see inside Remy's vintage closet and some of the pieces she owned and some of the images that inspired the photography and that aspect of the book, they can always go and have a look there. There's lots of beautiful photographs to look at there.
Very nice. Thank you for sharing that. I have to say, many years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I was in New York and I came face to face with a beautiful Gucci mini dress, and I wanted it, but I was very disappointed that the dealer knew exactly what it was, and he wanted more than I wanted to pay for it. So I did not buy it.
I know, it's much better when you can rummage around in the markets and find something before it's been bought by a dealer.
And I will give it back over to Jen.
Well, now I'd like to perhaps invite each author to ask the other a question about their novel. Natasha, do you have a question maybe for Kristin?
Of course, I do. When I was reading, I have so many questions that I could actually ask, but I'll just focus on one. I was really intrigued by the way you explored with the different partisan groups in the forest, the idea of revenge versus survival, because that's something I guess I've kind of looked at a little bit in my books as well, how war can bring out in some people the need for revenge, and in some people it's the need for survival. And I liked the way you explored that with those different partisan groups. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, actually.
Oh, well, thank you for the compliment. And that's such a great question. I think a lot of what I based that on was really how the real groups functioned. I mean, I think it was survival first. And once they figured out how to survive, what I found really fascinating was once they figured out how to survive and once they kind of had that down, they reverted back to just being people living in a society. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think I had always thought of it as, they're living in this forest. Every day must be about like, we have to survive. What are we going to do? But like at our heart, wherever we are in the world, whatever we're doing, we're all just people, right? And some people want to fight back. Some people want to protect what's close to them. Like there are as many reactions to being in a situation like that as there are people in the world, I think. But it was interesting to read in the real stories that once those basic survival needs were met, there was a sense of wanting to fight back. And I understand that because there had been so much taken from them, including just their right to live, right? I mean, their right to live and exist in society. And at a certain point, you just have to say, enough, you can't do this. So like we have to do something about it. And I think that was really the case in the forest. And I think as we also see unfold in the novel, guilt played a role. I think a lot of the people who found their way into the forest after people they loved were murdered, and carried with them for a long time that idea that they could have or should have done more, which, looking at it from an objective outside perspective, we realize that in so many of those cases, it was not something they could have changed, right? I mean, these were insurmountable, horrific things that they couldn't have stood up against. One of the things that Aaron Bielski said, and I think I mentioned that his parents had been arrested and taken away. He hid in the barn. He was there. He was there when they came for his parents. He was 14 and he hid in the barn. And he's 94 now, 80 years later. And I think he still lives with the guilt of not having done something about it. And when you think about that, what could he have done? I mean, he couldn't have stepped out and said, please don't take my parents. And they would have said, okay, we'll leave. I mean, he would have been taken too, and he would have been dead. But his wife was saying that to this day, most mornings he wakes up and sees his father standing at the foot of his bed, and in those seconds before he's conscious, right? And that particular statement stayed with me so much that 80 years later, you could still feel that guilt and that sense of being haunted by something, this moment that you made a choice that shaped your life, but that you'd always question, you know what I mean? And I think that guilt and that sense of I could have done more played a role in some of those people choosing to stand up to. I found that really powerful. And Natasha, I think it's very much the same thing you explore in the Riviera House and in some of your other books, where we look at people in an impossible situation. And as you were saying earlier, some people make that decision to risk everything to stand up and fight back. And it sounds to me, just from hearing you talk about it, that you're as fascinated as I am by the psychology that goes into that, by how do you make that decision? What kind of a person makes that decision? How do you reorder your priorities in a way that makes you feel that that's the only way to move forward? And my gosh, how brave do you have to be? So it's interesting. I think you and I had very different settings and very different stories in these two books, but I think that's one of the questions that the books have in common. Gosh, I had four brilliant questions for you written down, but they're essentially the ones Jennifer has already asked. I have questions about fashion in the Riviera House. Natasha, I'd love to ask you something that I feel like people ask me this a lot too. And I'm curious to hear your answer. I think World War II is having a moment. I mean, it's been having a moment for a long time. There are so many World War II books. It's its own genre now. And I love that. And I'm curious, why you think that is, why you think we're in this moment in time, but also why these stories feel so relevant. I mean, would you agree? I think they feel, when I'm reading a World War II story, I don't feel like I'm reading something that happened 80 years ago. It feels like something that has happened much more recently and it just feels so tangible, and I feel so connected to it. Do you feel the same way? And if so, why do you think that is?
Oh, absolutely. And I think for me, one of the things that I'm driven always to write about is stories of women who were doing something incredible at that time, and that somehow in history their stories have been forgotten, and those women have been forgotten, and they should never have been forgotten. And
Yes.
the injustice inherent in that, I just really galls me. And of course, we know that for so many years, history was definitely told from a male perspective, and it was stories of soldiers on the battlefield that were seen to be the heroic stories. And for so many years after the Second World War, it was widely believed that the resistance was the work of the men, when in fact it was the work of the women.
Yes.
And I think particularly now, when there have been so many, an explosion in stories of injustices to women, and we're starting to uncover more of those and talk about those in a much more open way, that
Yes.
particularly those stories resonate, because we can see that, I always say this about historical fiction. In some ways, it's wonderful because we can look back and go, oh, look how far we've come. But in some ways, we look back and we go, look how far we still have to go. These things
So true.
were happening decades ago, and they're still happening now. And in fact, if we look at, something like Texas, for example, we're almost going backwards into history. These rights that people have been fighting for decades, and that we finally made some headway in. Now they're all being repealed. And if that can happen, in one state and in relation to one particular law, then it could have so easily happen in so many other areas. And so I think that's why those stories are relevant, because we see the patterns that we try to fight against time and time again. And somehow, even though surely the past should be this hugely cautionary tale of what we should try our best to avoid, and how much kindness and love is so important, yet we still keep being drawn back into these terrible, dark moments. And so I think that's part of it. I always like to say that, I think the injustice most struck me last year when I was writing The Paris Secret, which is partly about Catherine Dior, Christian Dior's sister, who was a resistante. She She was a highly awarded after the war. Her work was incredibly important for the resistance. She was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp for about 9 months. She was on the last train out of Paris just before it was liberated, missed being saved by a matter of days, suffered terribly in the camp, survived just, made her way back to Christian and lived to a very old age. But the Dior sibling we remember is her brother, who, okay, he made beautiful gowns, but Catherine was the hero, not Christian. And that, again, that pattern repeats itself time and time again. So I think we come to these stories to see all of the other people who deserve to be remembered, and to hopefully, in the act of reading about them, give them this little act of remembrance that maybe they deserve. I guess that's how I see those war stories, as being particularly important for readers.
You are absolutely right. I agree. And you said that better than I ever say it when I'm asked that question. So I wish I'd been taking notes.
I'm sure that's not true.
Thank you so much, ladies. I will start asking some of the questions that I see are appearing in the Q&A. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to type it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure the question gets to Natasha and Kristin, or both. So the first question, it's to both authors, so I'll let you answer one at a time. What do you believe is your most important part of research? The reading you do, the personal interviews, movies, something else?
Do you want to start, Natasha?
No, you go.
Okay. For me, and I think I phrased it this way earlier, but for me, I think the reading forms the backbone of the story. So the vast amounts of research, whether like Natasha was saying about, visiting archives and accumulating all of these written documents of things that had occurred, or reading nonfiction books about it, whatever you can get your hands on that you can read as the story's forming in your head, I think that forms the backbone or the framework of the story. So that's very important. But I think it's those personal touches that bring it alive. Like I said, Aaron Bielski really gave this story a beating heart, because to hear it from the mouth of someone who actually lived through that was different than reading about it. Reading on paper, someone else's interpretation of what it would have been like. You know what I mean? But that's, it's sad, because we're really getting to the end of our ability to be able to ask those questions. I mean, the people who lived through that time period and were old enough at the time to remember it with clarity, are not going to be with us much longer. And so every time I get to speak to somebody who lived through that, it feels like a tremendous gift. And those are the things that I feel like are the key, in addition to the travel, like Natasha said, and actually putting your feet where your character's feet were, and smelling the smells and absorbing, everything about those moments. That's important too. But I think if you are lucky enough to actually talk to a person who lived through what you're talking about, I think that's, to me, the greatest gift.
Yeah, I agree. It's always those first-hand accounts that are the most vital parts of the research. And there was one, I wasn't able to speak to this person, but I was able to read their account, which really brought home to me how much these people were willing to risk for art during the Second World War. There's this one particular account. So the Mona Lisa, as I mentioned, was evacuated from the Louvre in August 1939, and she was actually moved to various different chateaux around France, because there are so many things that can damage artworks, humidity, floods, fires, vermin, etc. And so she was in an abbey in the south of France called Dieu, and it was very humid there. And the Mona Lisa is actually painted on wood, not canvas. So humidity and wood are not very good friends. So they knew they needed to move her to a different chateau. And because the humidity had been a problem to transport her, they put her in the back of a hermetically sealed van to keep out any humidity and air, which is great for a painting. But they also put a curator into the back of the hermetically sealed van to keep the Mona Lisa safe. So by the time the van had driven for 3 hours from Dieu to the next chateau where she was to be stored, They opened the back of the van. Mona Lisa's still smiling. She was perfectly fine, but the curator was unconscious from lack of
Oh my
oxygen.
gosh.
And I know, and I'm reading this account thinking, you couldn't make this stuff up. Like I literally could not put this in a book because people would go, that wouldn't happen. But, I'm reading this firsthand account from the curator and it actually did happen. I'm thinking, wow, they were absolutely willing to put everything on the line, risk their lives for the sake of the Mona Lisa because she was the most precious painting in all of France. So, it's without those firsthand accounts, you can't even begin to piece together a story. And I always write an author's note in the back, like you do, because I feel that often it's not just explaining, where you might have deviated from history, but it's actually saying this actually really did happen. I didn't make this stuff up. So
Yes.
I think that's really important as well.
I agree.
So for those of you listening in who have not read Natasha or Kristin's novels just yet, you will see both authors have extensive author's note at the end of the book. So they both do, they've both put in many, many, many hours of research for the novels. So there is a question here specifically for Kristin. Why didn't you name Zeus at the end of the book?
Why didn't I name him at the end of the book?
Yes, and I've heard this question from someone else. I don't want to give away too much because some people haven't read the book yet, but there is a line where in my mind, I knew you were referring to Zeus, but you don't say Zeus.
Like, are you talking about the very, very end where we've...
Yep.
That is so funny. Nobody has ever asked me that before because it took me a second. I'm like, I'm not even sure what they're talking about. That is a great question because I've never heard it, and that's awesome. I don't get very many ones anymore that I haven't heard. I think in just thinking back through what my thought process was, I believe those last, I can't remember if it's not the whole epilogue, but it's the last page or so. Unspools like a fairy tale almost, and it mirrors the beginning of the book. And so in writing it that way, fairy tale-ish, but not quite a fairy tale, just like the beginning of the book, I think it provides kind of a bookends for the novel. Does that make sense? So I wasn't
Yes.
trying to be coy about it. It is, I mean, it's Zeus. I'm not, she, I don't know. I'm sorry. I was about to make a joke that was going to be a spoiler, so I'll just keep that to myself. But no, Oh, that's a great question. Now I'm going to have to go back and reread my last chapter and ask myself all sorts of questions. Yeah.
Okay, so to this particular person, it did not make sense to me. I read between the lines, but maybe it's because of the beginning and then the end. I was just like, oh yes, this is Zeus. but everyone has a different interpretation. This is a bit of a bigger question, might take a couple of minutes from each of you. The question is, for each of you, can you tell us a bit more about your next book and what are you reading right now?
Natasha, do you want to start with that?
Okay, so at the moment I'm working on a book, so I've focused a lot on women during wartime in my last couple of books, but another period that really fascinates me is the immediate post-war period for women, because whilst the Second World War was a huge time of change for women, where many of them worked and were independent, earned money, were put into roles spying, curing people around countries, etc., doing these incredibly brave things. Immediately after the war, we had governments running propaganda campaigns, basically saying to women, you must give up your job, give it back to the men who need the job, and actually your place is, in the kitchen cooking roast dinners. There are propaganda posters showing women, in their apron in the kitchen making dinner, and that was deemed to be their place. And I feel, what would that have felt like to have been the woman doing the spying, doing these incredibly brave things, and to then be told, actually, we don't need you now. Now your job is to look after everybody else. And so I really wanted to explore that in a book. And so that's coming in my next one, which is told through the eyes of the female public relations director at the newly opened House of Christian Dior in Paris in 1947. which was a lot of fun to write. It also has a dual narrative, not a contemporary one, but one that goes back to the Second World War, to the Italian theatre of war, and Switzerland as well, which, whilst a neutral country, there was a hell of a lot going on in Switzerland during wartime too. I feel like those are areas of war that have been underrepresented. So it's been great to unpeel those a bit in this story as well.
Sounds really interesting. I'll be looking forward to that one.
Thank you, Natasha.
So timely too. I mean, I feel like women are struggling with that so much now too. Like not being told you can't work, but basically being told you have to do it all, but like your main responsibility is being at home and folding the laundry. There is still that. There is still that idea that that's where we belong. And so it's extremely timely again, even though it took place, 70 years ago. That's interesting. Yeah. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
So, Kristin, will your next novel also be set in the post-war era?
Part of it will be. I am only about a quarter of the way into writing it. It doesn't come out until March of 2023, so it's not due quite yet. Although
A little while.
I do need to. What's that?
A little while. We have to wait a little while.
A little while. I need to pick up the writing pace though. If I'm actually going to make that my deadline to get it published by March of 23. But it is a dual timeline story that is partially during World War II, in the suburbs of Paris, which were bombed heavily, with civilian casualties, which is something that happened all around Europe, but that I find really interesting. So there are two mothers and two daughters whose lives change in one of these bombings, and then we pick up their story in 1960 New York, where we kind of see what has happened in the lives of each of these women impacted by that bombing, and what happens kind of going forward. And they have to put together all these mysterious missing pieces. And to me, I've always been very fascinated by the impact of what happened during the war on the lives that we lived afterwards. And in the past, I've explored that through people who survived the war and what happens like 2 generations later. So like not their children's generation, but the grandchild's generation. Because I'm fascinated by, again, we're just kind of talking about it, the stories that you pass down without actually speaking the words, and how the way you raise your children is impacted by your past, and the way they raise their children is impacted by that, and all of that. But I'm really interested in looking at it in a more direct way. And so it's really a story about motherhood and about, what makes a mother, and what happens when those things that make you a mother are taken away from you and are destroyed, and where do you go from there, and how does your life change? And so it's about motherhood and war and art. Art, Natasha. So.
Oh, yay. That sounds fabulous.
So lots to look forward to from both our authors tonight. Thank you, ladies, so much. I will just ask you, since it was another question within the question, but what is the last book that you read that you really enjoyed, Natasha?
I've just finished reading a book called Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. It might have been published as The Last Migration in America, perhaps. Sometimes we get different titles over here. And it's just amazing. It's about a woman tracking, it's set in a slightly post future world. She's tracking the migration of the last Arctic terns, which have the longest migration pattern in the world, from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And it's just a beautiful story about extinction and survival and love and family, and I was absolutely swept away by it. Definitely recommend it.
Thank you, Natasha. And
Sounds so
Kristin,
good.
do you have one to share as well?
I do. I just blurbed a book that is coming out in Canada sometime in the new year. And I was just looking for the name of the author because for whatever reason it's escaping me. The book is called Looking for Jane. And I was actually thinking of it earlier when Natasha mentioned Texas, because it's a book about an underground abortion network that operated in Canada while abortion was still illegal.
Yep.
And I thought it was so good because it explored Mother, it didn't at all read like, like, hi, I'm a pro-choice book and I want you to believe the things I believe. It was just such a deep, just a deep exploration of the people who were
Mm,
involved in this movement, then and now. And also it was an exploration of motherhood. I just thought it was so good. It's called Looking for
mm.
Jane. It's going to be out in Canada. It's set in Canada. And it comes out sometime in the new year, I think. It was phenomenal. I really liked it. And then something that's out now, or about to come out, is a book called Once Upon a Wardrobe by Patty Callahan. And Anissa is saying Heather Marshall. Yes, I think the author was Heather Marshall. Thank you, Anissa. Anissa always knows everything. Thank you, Anissa. She's like the other half of my brain. I appreciate it. Seriously, every time I'm at a virtual event and I'm like, I don't know, like Anissa pops in with the answer. So thank you. Um, Patty Callahan's Once Upon a Wardrobe, which is coming out next week. I think it's October 19th. And it is the a story of a young woman in England in the 1950s who goes to C.S. Lewis to ask him where the story of Narnia came from. And it's just so well
Oh.
done. And it's she worked on it with C.S. Lewis's stepson. So like he was her main resource, and he shared all these memories of his stepfather from when he was a child. And it's just so good. I mean, Patty's a friend of mine. I should issue that as a disclaimer. We're friends and fiction co-hosts together. But it's a beautiful book. I loved it. And
Mm,
it has kind of all those wintry feels that we're
mm.
after as the weather changes.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you, Kristin, and thank you, Natasha. I think those are the questions we have for you for tonight. I know Jen and I bombarded you with questions about
They're
both of your
great.
books. We loved them both. So just to repeat, The Riviera House by Natasha Lester, and The Forest of Vanishing Stars by Kristin Harmel. Please get your hands on them, either at the library, you can put your name down for them, or you can contact our librarian. She'll give you all the information to be able to purchase one of their copies through Paragraph's Bookstore. Thank you very much again, ladies. Thank you, Jen, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you so
Thank you so
much.
much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you,
So much
everyone.
fun.
Have a good evening.